been a few months since I entered Japan for the very first time in my life, before which I had actually been learning Japanese every single day for over the past 5 years. However, only recently did I start considering myself relatively fluent in the language, which is why I was interested in seeing how well my Japanese was going to hold up in real life. My first interaction in Japanese happened at the Narita airport as I was getting my residency card. I subconsciously said yes in Japanese to the clerk when asked a question in English, which was enough for her to start speaking entirely in Japanese from there on, all of which I understood fine. However, since I still wasn't used to using Japanese in real life, I accidentally ended the conversation with an English thank you. In fact, before my flight to Japan, I first had a flight to Poland and I kept accidentally saying thanks to people in Estonian instead of using English as well. Anyway, after that, I met up with a friend at the airport with whom I also spoke in Japanese, and he challenged me to go to the help desk and ask where I can buy an EU to Japanese converter blog. And even though I was a bit reluctant at first, I was surprised at how smoothly I was able to make that interaction. The help desk suggested looking into the Lawson Konbini inside the Narita airport that unfortunately didn't carry any, so I instead bought some Kalpis, which was a drink that I had drank once at a Japanese restaurant in Estonia that by now has unfortunately gone bankrupt. On the same day, I interacted with 2 other people on my way to where I was staying, and one of the most memorable mistakes I made was using the word hoiru to describe the steering wheel of a car when the correct word was handoru, which caused a slight confusion when I was trying to explain that unlike in Japan, the steering wheels are on the left-hand side of the car in Estonia. On the following days, most of my interactions, aside from speaking with my friend, were in stores. For example, I asked if the store had a certain size shoe, and at the checkout, I was presented with an unexpected question that contained the word ikkatsu, and after pondering for a moment, I was relieved that I was able to recall the word ikkatsu barai, meaning one-time payment, aka I was asked whether or not I want to pay in a single payment, and I've been asked this question almost every time I try to pay for something in Japan, so it's definitely worth memorizing. Soon after, I also tried registering for a gym membership, which ended up being a pretty long and complicated process as I had to quickly read through multiple service agreements and fill out numerous forms as quickly as possible, meaning that I essentially took a real-life JLPT N1 exam considering the complexity of the vocabulary, but luckily I was able to ace the entire test both in terms of listening, reading, and as a bonus, even outputting. However, where I completely failed was when I had to handwrite my own name and address in Japanese. Now, throughout my entire 5 years of learning Japanese, I never properly learned to handwrite any Japanese whatsoever, so I had to look at the kana and kanji on my phone whilst desperately trying to replicate them with a random stroke order, and this happened so many times during the first few weeks, so I really recommend learning to handwrite at least your name and place of stay in Japanese. Even when a service lets you register online, often what ends up happening instead is that you'll need to register both online as well as in person on paper, and sometimes you'll also have to fill out the same information on multiple different paper-based forms, which is something I especially experienced when I bought a bicycle and also registered it into the Bohan Doroku. Since I was in Japan with a working holiday visa, I had to register my Japanese address at the town hall within the first 2 weeks of my stay, which was a process that also included signing up for national health insurance as well as pension, which luckily I was exempt from paying. In terms of Japanese, this was definitely the most challenging encounter I had thus far, especially the part where one of the clerks quickly mumbled the minute details of the health insurance, and while I wasn't able to perfectly hear all of it, I still got the gist of the important parts, and overall, everything went pretty smoothly, except for when I had to once again fill out a bunch of forms in Japanese via handwriting. By the way, these are all the paper-based documents and so on that I received within just the first few weeks of my stay. However, where my Japanese was truly challenged though was when I went to a clinic and signed up for a certain treatment plan which required an hour of consulting, during which I asked and was asked quite a lot of questions related to it, and I also had to read through and fill multiple documents that contained a lot of field-specific vocabulary relating to various medical conditions, potential side effects, the general procedure of the treatment, payment plans and so on, all of which I genuinely had to go through really quickly as other otherwise I would have ran out of time. It was a genuinely demanding process, but in the end, it really made me feel how fluent I had become in this language, considering that I pretty much understood everything right away, but also that if my Japanese had been any less fluent, then many of these scenarios would have been incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, considering that, for example, this clinic probably wouldn't have accepted visitors that aren't fluent in Japanese for completely understandable reasons. Over the course of those 5 years, I learned over 20,000 Japanese words, and a large part of that vocabulary came from sentence mining Japanese YouTube videos, which is a form of media that's probably as close as it gets to natural Japanese, and I'm very glad that that's the path I took due to how well it carried over to real life, both in terms of comprehension as well as outputting. Ironically, I'm also very glad that I spent so much time on Anki, because it meant that I had a pretty strong recognition ability even of less common words that otherwise I wouldn't have seen all that often in my regular day-to-day immersion, and my ability to instantly recognize and understand said uncommon words was absolutely vital during these interactions, as well as when reading these forms, during which I never had to look up even a single word, nor did I ever feel the need to switch back to English because everything felt doable entirely in Japanese. At one point, I also visited an event in Tokyo where, once again, knowing Japanese was very valuable already when it came to things such as being able to understand the instructions shouted on a megaphone related to how to follow the unwritten rules of the event, such as how to properly line up, when and where to not stop moving, and so on. But aside from in-person interactions, I also looked up quite a lot of information and reviews of various places online, as well as when buying things such as second-hand camera equipment from sites like Mercari and Rakuten, which were pretty funny to use directly now, considering that before I had used them through a proxy when I was making the buy video. I also applied for a cashback campaign run by Sony, where you had to follow rather complicated instructions and handcraft an envelope that contained a bunch of documents that you needed to send to them, for which I also needed to go to a konbini in order to print and scan a few papers, during which at one point I also asked help from an employee, as well as whether or not the store carried any postage stamps that I needed for sending out the envelope. And by the way, you can only use cash to pay for stamps even when buying them from a konbini. Moreover, I went to an actual camera shop to do maintenance and checks on a second-hand camera I had bought, and it ended up being once again a rather pleasant long-form interaction in Japanese, although through it I did discover that the second-hand camera I had bought had some unremovable dirt stuck to the sensor, and the clerk mentioned that if I deem it to be a problem, they can send it to Sony for specialized cleaning, which might be a potential 5,000 yen fix, in the case that it's actual removable dirt and not a scratch, but I decided to instead just bear that in mind, at least for now. However, this isn't to say that everything always went perfectly smoothly though. Sometimes just a lack of experience of how to do something in Japan can be difficult, regardless of whether or not you can understand Japanese. For example, I wanted to refund something I had bought online, and the process of sending the refund package in the post office was complicated to the extent that it even took a very long time for my native Japanese friend to figure out the proper way to fill out the correct forms, who I forced to do the entire process for me, in the case I scribbled the addresses too sloppy when I jotted. Speaking of packages, there were multiple instances where I had to accept a delivery at my front door, and all of those interactions were once again very friendly and pleasant. Perhaps the biggest quote-unquote culture shock for me was how good and friendly Japanese customer service actually was, at least compared to Estonia, where the standard is to feel like you're making someone's day worse whenever you enter a store or use a service, so I occasionally even felt bad over how well I was treated here in Japan. Also, I'm glad to say that every interaction I've had in Japan thus far has been entirely in Japanese. No one has ever tried speaking English to me, nor has anyone dumbed down their Japanese, even when they are the ones to start the conversation. I've also never been Nihongo Jōzut, except for longer casual conversations where my Japanese has come up as a topic, and I've never seen a surprised, shocked, or concerned expression when interacting with natives in Japanese, which is why I don't personally feel like I'm being treated all that different despite being a foreigner, and I think my Japanese ability has a lot to do with it, as most natives probably assume that I've already been living in Japan for years, despite my output still being very far from true native level. Learning a foreign language to a very high level through culturally enriching immersion gives, first and foremost, you the ability to relate to natives, and therefore natives the ability to relate to you by bonding over shared cultural experiences and references ideas that otherwise could never be truly communicated. If you've seen my yearly Japanese update videos, then you probably already know that I actually never directly learned Japanese for the sake of using it in Japan. However, throughout this visit, I was able to discover the wide range of new possibilities that I wasn't even aware that I had already unlocked thanks to having learned this language. And now I can also definitely say that learning Japanese to fluency is absolutely realistic and doable as long as you stay consistent and always keep going. If you're interested in learning Japanese yourself, a few years ago I made a tutorial series on how I personally recommend learning Japanese, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so either on Patreon by using the YouTube Super Thanks or my Migaku Ref link. So that's it for this video, and I hope it was interesting to hear my experience of finally using Japanese in real life after learning it for all these years, and I wish you the best on your own language learning journey as well.